The cold metallic floors of the lunar outpost echoed softly, with each step Commander Ethan Cade took, his military boots making a rhythmic thud against the steel beneath him. He was no stranger to tension, but this was different. The quiet of the outpost felt suffocating, an unnatural calm that set his nerves on edge. It was a far cry from the chaos of the war zones he'd fought in. But in some ways, this was worse. Out there, in battle, things were simple. There were enemies, there were objectives, and there was survival. Here, in the sterile silence of the moon base, it felt like he was standing on the precipice of something much larger and far more dangerous. His mind had been racing ever since the arrival of the alien ship, a sleek, obsidian craft that hovered like a ghost above the lunar surface, silent and enigmatic. The Kyle, a species humanity had known about only in whispers, had made their presence known a week ago, and nothing had been the same since. They hadn't come to conquer or invade, at least not in the traditional sense. They had come seeking help, but their request had left the Earth leadership reeling. Ethan's orders had come suddenly and without much explanation. He'd been stationed on the lunar base to oversee a military operation, but now his role had shifted. He was to act as a liaison between Earth and the alien visitors. As a soldier, he was used to following orders without question. But this time, he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was deeply, irreversibly wrong. Commander Cade, report to the diplomatic wing immediately. The voice crackled over his earpiece, breaking through the fog of his thoughts. He exhaled slowly, adjusting the collar of his uniform as he approached the diplomatic wing. He had been briefed before, just the basics, but what he knew already felt like more than enough to rattle him. The Kyle were dying, their species teetering on the brink of extinction. A biological crisis had ravaged their population, rendering them unable to reproduce. They had scoured the galaxy for a solution, and somehow human DNA had emerged as their last hope. How much Ethan knew. What he didn't understand was why they'd come to him. As the doors to the meeting room slid open with a quiet hiss, the tension in the air hit him like a wave. Inside, diplomats, scientists, and military officers gathered around a central table, their faces grim. Listen, but it wasn't the humans in the room who drew Ethan's attention. No, the true source of unease stood at the far end, near the observation window. Lena, the leader of the Kyle delegation, her appearance was mesmerizing, as otherworldly as it was unsettling. She stood taller than most humans, her silver skin catching the harsh light of the room and reflecting it in a way that made her seem to shimmer. Her golden eyes, sharp and intelligent, locked onto Ethan the moment he stepped inside, and he felt a jolt of something primal, deep inside him. Her long, sleek black hair cascaded over her shoulders, framing a face that was both alien and stunningly beautiful. But it wasn't just her physical appearance that struck him. It was her presence, the way she seemed to dominate the space around her, with a quiet but undeniable authority. Ethan squared his shoulders as he approached her, willing his pulse to slow. He was a soldier, trained to handle anything. But as Lana's gaze followed his every movement, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something far beyond his control. Commander Cade, Lana greeted him, her voice a perfect blend of softness and power. It was melodic, but there was an edge to it, something that hinted at the weight of the secrets she carried. I'm glad you've come. We have much to discuss. Ethan nodded, trying to ignore the sudden rush of adrenaline that coursed through his veins. I've been briefed on your situation, he said, his voice steady, though inside he was anything but calm. But I'd like to hear it from you. Lana's golden eyes never wavered as she took a step closer to him. Our situation is more dire than your briefings could fully convey. She began, her voice lowering slightly, as if the gravity of her words was too heavy for the room. My people are dying, Commander. Our species can no longer reproduce naturally. We've exhausted every option. Genetic manipulation, cloning, artificial insemination. Nothing has worked. Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling on him like an immense burden. He had been prepared for battle, for conflict, but this was something else entirely. You said our DNA is compatible, he said, though he already knew the answer, that we can help. Lana nodded, her gaze intense. Yes, your species is the closest genetic match we've found in all our searches. Human DNA has the potential to stabilize our genome, to save us from extinction. But we need more than just a scientific solution. Ethan frowned, trying to grasp the enormity of what she was implying. What exactly are you asking for? For the first time, a shadow of hesitation crossed Lana's face, but she quickly regained her composure. I need you, Commander Cade, she said, her voice soft but unyielding. Not just your DNA. I need you to father a child with me. The words hit him like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, the room seemed to spin. Everything narrowed to just the two of them, the sterile environment of the lunar base fading into the background. Ethan could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, the implications of her request slamming into him all at once. I don't understand, he stammered, trying to regain his composure. You want me to? Yes, she interrupted, her voice cool but firm. For the sake of my people, we need you to father a hybrid child. Your DNA, combined with mine, could create a being capable of carrying both of our species forward. The rawness of her statement rattled him, and he took a step back, struggling to process the enormity of what she was proposing. He had been trained to handle danger, to face enemies in combat. But this was something else entirely. Lana took a step closer, her golden eyes never leaving his. I know this is difficult to accept, she said quietly, her voice softening for the first time. But we have no more time. Every day that passes, more of my people die, and soon there will be no one left to save. I'm asking you, not as a soldier, but as a partner in this. I need you, Commander. Ethan's throat tightened as he searched for words. He had been prepared for a diplomatic mission, for negotiations and tense discussions. But this felt like it was tearing at the very fabric of who he was. Why me? He finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Out of all the people you could have chosen, why did you come to me? For the first time, Lana's steely demeanor cracked, and Ethan saw something vulnerable in her gaze. It wasn't just random chance, she admitted, her voice low. Our research revealed that you possess certain traits, qualities that make you an ideal candidate. But there's something else. She hesitated, glancing down before meeting his eyes again. Your presence affects me in a way I didn't expect. My body responds to you. This is not just about genetics. The air between them felt charged, and Ethan suddenly understood what was happening. Something about the Kyle biology, something beyond reason, was creating an undeniable attraction between them. He could feel it too, a growing pull that defied logic, a primal connection that was impossible to ignore. You're saying I don't have a choice, Ethan said, his voice thick with confusion and reluctance. Lana stepped even closer, her gaze never wavering. You do have a choice, she said softly. I cannot force this upon you, but I am asking you, as a woman whose people are dying, will you help me? For a long moment, Ethan stared into her golden eyes, feeling the weight of her plea settle over him like a shroud. His mind raced, clashing between duty and the overwhelming ethical questions that raged within him. Could he do this? Could he father a child with an alien? Even if it meant saving an entire species. The implications were staggering. This too much, Ethan whispered, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. I don't know how to process this. I understand, Lana said quietly, her voice filled with a mixture of desperation and strength. But there is no other way. I chose you because you understand what it means to sacrifice, to fight for something greater than yourself. You fought for your people before. Now, I'm asking you to fight for mine. Ethan closed his eyes, the weight of her words sinking in. He knew what it meant to make sacrifices. He had done it before, in battle, in missions that had cost him everything. But this was on a scale he had never imagined. And yet as he stood there, staring at her, he couldn't deny the connection that was building between them. It was primal, beyond reason, and it called to him in a way he couldn't explain. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ethan exhaled slowly and nodded. All right, Lana, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll help you. The tension in the room lifted slightly, and Lana's shoulders relaxed. But there was no relief in her expression, only a solemn acknowledgement of what had just been set in motion. Thank you, Commander, she said softly. You don't know what this means to me. To my people. Ethan wasn't sure he could fully grasp the enormity of his decision just yet. But one thing was certain. His life and the future of both humanity and the Kyle had just changed forever. The room felt smaller now, as though the gravity of Lana's request had physically shrunk the space around them. Commander Ethan Cade stood in the middle of the meeting room, his mind racing, his breath shallow. The cold, sterile atmosphere of the lunar base had always felt detached, a place of science and procedure. But now, the weight of the situation pressed down on him like a suffocating force. The walls seemed to close in, and the hum of machinery in the background faded into a distant buzz, drowned out by the pounding of his own heartbeat in his ears. "I need you to father a child with me." It wasn't a simple request, not by any measure. It wasn't something that could be easily categorized into the military chain of command or a diplomatic negotiation. This was personal, intimate, and far beyond the scope of anything Ethan had ever been trained for. He had been prepared for combat, for high-stakes missions, and even for situations where he had to make life or death decisions. But this was a different kind of battleground. He glanced at Lena, who stood across from him, her golden eyes watching him closely. Her silver skin seemed to glow faintly in the low light, and there was something both ethereal and powerful about her presence. She wasn't just an alien emissary. She was the leader of a dying species, and she had come to him, not as a soldier, but as a woman seeking salvation for her people. The enormity of her request wasn't lost on him, and neither was the desperation behind it. "Why me?" Ethan asked again, his voice quieter this time, almost a whisper. The question felt inadequate given the circumstances, but it was the only thing he could cling to in the storm of thoughts swirling in his head. "Out of all the people on Earth, why choose me?" Lana's gaze softened, and for a moment, the tension between them eased as she took a step closer. "It wasn't just a random decision, Commander. You are uniquely compatible, not just biologically, but in ways we cannot fully explain. Our scientists conducted extensive research before we arrived. Your DNA has certain traits that make you an ideal candidate for hybridization." She paused, her voice lowering to a more intimate tone. "But there is something else. When I'm near you, my body reacts in ways I did not expect. There is a connection between us, one that is more than just science." Ethan blinked, trying to wrap his head around what she was saying. A connection. He hadn't noticed anything unusual when he was around her, except, of course, for the undeniable pull he had felt since the moment he first saw her. But he had chalked that up to her alien beauty, to the strangeness of standing in the presence of someone so unlike anyone he had ever known. Now, though, Lana was suggesting something deeper, something that went beyond mere attraction. He shifted uncomfortably, his mind still struggling to grasp the enormity of what she was proposing. "You said this was about survival, about saving your people." His voice was firmer now, though the uncertainty still lingered beneath the surface. "But you're asking me to do something I never imagined doing. This isn't just about science, is it?" Lena shook her head slowly, her long black hair shimmering like liquid midnight as it moved. "No, Commander. This is about survival, yes, but it is also about something more fundamental. We are asking for your help because we believe that the bond between us, the bond between you and me, could strengthen the hybridization process. We need a connection that goes beyond mere genetics. We need intimacy." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Ethan's chest tightened as the full weight of the situation settled over him. This wasn't just about creating a hybrid child in a laboratory. Lana was asking him to engage in a deeply personal, deeply intimate act, one that would tie him to her and to her people in ways he hadn't anticipated. "I don't know if I can do this," Ethan admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm a soldier, Lana. I've been trained to fight, to protect, to follow orders. But it's too personal." Lana's expression softened, and for the first time since they had begun speaking, Ethan saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. "I know what I am asking of you is difficult," she said quietly, her voice laced with emotion, "but I would not ask if there were another way. Every day that passes, more of my people die. Our reproductive crisis is worsening, and soon we will have no chance of survival. You are our last hope." Ethan turned away from her, pacing a few steps toward the observation window that overlooked the barren lunar landscape. Outside, The Kyle's obsidian ship hovered silently above the surface, a dark silhouette against the stars. The ship was a constant reminder of the stakes, of the impending extinction that loomed over Lana's people. But it was also a reminder of the impossible choice Ethan now faced. His reflection in the glass was pale, drawn, and tense. He could see the weight of the decision etched in his own face, the lines of worry, the uncertainty in his eyes. This wasn't a battlefield he was familiar with. There were no clear enemies, no strategies to employ. It was just him and the enormity of what was being asked of him. "You're asking me to father a child," he said, his voice thick with the weight of the words. "A child that would be part human, part Kyle. I don't even know what that means. I don't know what that would look like. What kind of life that child would have. Have you thought about that?" Lana was silent for a moment, her golden eyes following his movements as he paced. "We have thought about it," she said finally, her voice quieter now, almost hesitant. "The child would be unique, unlike any other being in the galaxy, but they would also be a symbol of hope, of unity between our species. They would be a bridge that could ensure the survival of both our worlds." Ethan stopped pacing, turning to face her again. His fists clenched at his sides as he struggled with the enormity of the decision in front of him. Could he do this? Could he bring himself to father a child with an alien species, knowing the implications not just for himself, but for humanity and the Kyle? The thought of it made his stomach twist with uncertainty, and yet deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was already moving toward a decision he wasn't sure he wanted to make. "You're asking me to change everything," he said, his voice low and strained. "This isn't just about saving your people. This is about altering the course of human history. What happens if this works? What happens if the child is born and it changes everything? What if the world isn't ready for this?" Lana stepped closer to him, her golden eyes searching his face with an intensity that made his heart race. "The world may never be ready," she admitted, "but that doesn't mean we can stand by and do nothing. I understand your fear, Ethan. I understand your hesitation, but we cannot let fear dictate our choices. My people do not have the luxury of time. We need you, now more than ever." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a physical force. He had faced impossible odds before, had made decisions in the heat of battle that had determined the fate of entire missions. But this was different. This was personal, intimate, and it required a level of trust and vulnerability he wasn't sure he was ready to give. "You're not asking for a soldier anymore," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're asking for something more." Lana nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Yes," she said softly, "I'm asking for you. Not as a soldier, but as a man. As someone who can help me save my people, not just with science, but with something deeper. Something only you can give." Ethan stared at her, the reality of the situation sinking in like a stone in his gut. He had never felt so conflicted, so torn between duty and the deep, primal instincts that tugged at him. He had always been a man of action, someone who knew how to take control of a situation and make the hard choices. But this was different. This was about creating life, about forging a connection with someone who was as different from him as any being in the universe. And yet, in that difference, he felt a strange and undeniable pull. "I don't know if I can do this," Ethan admitted, his voice raw with emotion. "But if I say yes, if I agree to this, I need to know that it's for more than just survival. I need to know that it means something." Lana stepped closer, her golden eyes locking onto his with an intensity that took his breath away. "It does mean something," she said softly. "It means everything." Ethan felt the final pieces of his resistance crumble, the weight of the decision settling over him like a heavy cloak. There was no turning back now. Whatever happened next, it would change everything. Not just for him, but for humanity and the Kyle. And as he looked into Lana's eyes, he knew that the course of his life had just shifted in ways he could never have anticipated. With a deep, steadying breath, he nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll do it." Lana's expression softened, and for the first time, Ethan saw a flicker of hope in her golden eyes. "Thank you, Ethan," she whispered. "You don't know what this means to me, to my people." He wasn't sure he fully understood the enormity of what he had just agreed to. But one thing was certain: his life and the future of two species had just been irrevocably changed. The sterile hum of the lunar base filled the quiet corridors, but inside Ethan Cade's mind, there was nothing but noise. The weight of his decision pressed down on him as he walked through the empty hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. He had agreed to something unimaginable, something that defied all the lines he had drawn as a soldier, as a man of duty. Lana's words echoed in his mind, her soft, unwavering voice still holding him captive. I need you, not just as a soldier, but as a man. The air felt thicker as he approached his quarters, and though his body moved on autopilot, his mind was still reeling. He had spent his career dealing with life or death decisions, situations that required sharp instincts and split-second reactions. This was different. This was a decision that carried a weight beyond the battlefield, beyond anything he had ever prepared for. When the door slid shut behind him, Ethan was left alone in his small utilitarian room. The walls were bare except for a few personal items, a reminder of the life he had led on Earth before being stationed on the moon. He sat heavily on the edge of the bed, running a hand through his short-cropped hair, trying to make sense of everything. How did it come to this? The images from the meeting replayed in his mind. Lana's silver skin glinting under the sterile light of the room, her golden eyes locked onto his with that quiet intensity that had unnerved him from the beginning. Her presence had filled the space in a way no one else's could. And though she was alien in every way, there was something undeniably human about the way she looked at him, about the vulnerability she allowed to peek through the cracks in her composure. He had never imagined that he would be standing on the edge of such a monumental decision, one that would alter not only his life, but the future of two species. And yet, here he was, the weight of that choice pressing down on his chest like a boulder. Lana had asked him to cross a line that had never even existed for him before. It wasn't just about survival or duty anymore. It was about intimacy. It was about trust. And somehow, it was about her. Ethan exhaled slowly, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he stared at the floor. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind replaying the moment when he had agreed to Lana's request. There had been no going back the second he said yes. And now all that remained was the unknown future they were about to walk into. The sound of the door opening startled him from his thoughts. He looked up, and there she was. Lana, her tall, graceful figure seemed even more imposing in the low light at his quarters, and her golden eyes shimmered with a quiet intensity that made his breath catch. She moved into the room without hesitation, the door sliding shut behind her, enclosing them in the confined space. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt charged, heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. Lana's gaze lingered on him, her antennae twitching slightly, sensing the tension that crackled in the room. She moved closer, her steps slow and deliberate, as if she knew exactly what this moment meant. Ethan, she said softly, her voice like a whisper in the stillness. I wanted to make sure you were certain. He stood up slowly, his heart hammering in his chest as her words washed over him. I am, he replied, though his voice was thick with emotion. But it's not what I expected. It's not what I ever thought I'd be doing. Lana nodded, her golden eyes searching his face for any sign of hesitation. It's not what I imagined either, she admitted, her voice quiet, almost vulnerable. But I know there's no other way. This is more than a mission for me. It's survival. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Her words were raw, honest, and they resonated deep inside him. He could see the weight of the responsibility she carried. The burden of knowing her people's future rested on a decision that was so personal, so intimate. It wasn't just about saving her species. It was about her, about them. She took another step closer, and now they were only inches apart. Ethan could feel the heat radiating from her body, the strange and magnetic pull that had been there since the moment they met. He had tried to deny it, tried to push it aside, but now, standing here with her so close, it was impossible to ignore. I've never done anything like this, he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm not sure I know how to. Lana reached out then, her hand gently brushing his cheek, the warmth of her touch sending a shiver through him. Her skin was smooth, almost metallic, but the gesture was so human, so filled with understanding that Ethan found himself leaning into it, drawn to her in a way he hadn't expected. You don't have to be certain of everything, she whispered, her voice soft but sure. Just be with me, here and now. That's all I'm asking. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, letting her words sink in. The tension in his chest eased slightly as he let himself accept the reality of what was happening. There was no need for logic here, no need for strategy. This was about connection, about trust, about something far more profound than any mission or duty. When he opened his eyes again, Lana was still there, her golden gaze steady and patient. Slowly, he reached out, his hand gently resting on her arm. The warmth of her skin beneath his fingers was both familiar and strange, a reminder of how different they were. And yet, in this moment, those differences didn't matter. Lana moved closer and Ethan could feel the electric tension between them intensify. Her body pressed against his, and for a brief moment, the world outside seemed to disappear. The sterile walls of the lunar base, the cold, unfeeling machinery, all of it faded into the background as the space between them closed. Without a word, their lips met in a slow, tentative kiss. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, as though they were both testing the waters of something so new, so unexpected. But then, the hesitation melted away, and the kiss deepened, growing in intensity as the connection between them solidified. There was no room for doubt anymore. This was happening. They were crossing the line together. Ethan's hands moved to her waist, pulling her closer as the heat between them grew. Lana's arms wrapped around his neck, her fingers tangling in his hair as the kiss became more urgent, more desperate. The pull between them was undeniable now, a force that neither of them could resist. They moved together as though they had done this 1,000 times, their bodies finding a rhythm that felt both familiar and foreign. Ethan's heart raced as his hands roamed over her body, the smoothness of her silver skin sending jolts of electricity through him. There was something primal, something deeply intimate about the way they touched. And for the first time, Ethan allowed himself to let go of the fear, the doubt, the uncertainty. He lifted her effortlessly, carrying her to the small bed in the corner of the room. Lana's breath hitched as he laid her down gently, his body hovering over hers. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Ethan knew there was no turning back. This wasn't just about saving her species. This was about something deeper, something that transcended their differences. Lana's hands moved to the buttons of his shirt, her fingers trembling slightly as she worked them free. Ethan's pulse quickened as he leaned down, kissing her neck, her collarbone, the soft skin just below her ear. Every touch, every kiss felt like a promise, one that neither of them fully understood, but both were willing to make. The rest of their clothes fell away in a slow, deliberate dance, and when they were finally bare, the intensity between them only grew. The room seemed to pulse with the energy of their connection, the electric charge that had been simmering beneath the surface, now fully ignited. Lana's golden eyes locked onto his, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps as their bodies moved together. Ethan could feel her heartbeat against his chest, the rhythm of their movement sinking in a way that felt almost otherworldly. It wasn't just about physical desire. It was about something more, something that bound them together in a way that was deeper than either of them had anticipated. Time seemed to blur as they lost themselves in each other, the world outside the small room fading into nothingness. It was just them now, two beings from different worlds, crossing a line that had never been crossed before. When the moment finally came, it wasn't explosive or chaotic. It was quiet, filled with a sense of calm that neither of them had expected. Ethan collapsed beside Lana, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. The room was filled with the quiet hum of the bass, but the air between them felt different now. It was charged with the weight of what they had just shared, what they had just created. Lana turned to him, her golden eyes soft and filled with something Ethan couldn't quite name. She reached out, her hand resting gently on his chest, and for the first time since this all began, he felt a sense of peace. "We've crossed the line," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness of the room. Ethan nodded, his hand covering hers as he looked into her eyes. "Yeah," he replied softly. The room was bathed in a low, intimate glow from the overhead lights, casting soft shadows on the walls of the lunar base. In that quiet space, the tension between Ethan and Lana had transformed into something undeniable, something that neither of them could resist any longer. Their shared mission, the weight of saving an entire species, had melted away in the heat of the moment. It wasn't just about duty anymore. It was about the connection they had formed, one that was both primal and deeply personal. Ethan's heart pounded as he leaned in, feeling the warmth of Lana's breath against his skin. Her golden eyes, filled with both intensity and vulnerability, held his gaze, drawing him closer. There was no hesitation now, no questioning the line they had crossed. This was a moment born out of necessity, but it had become something more, something intimate, something raw, as their lips met again. The kiss was no longer tentative but full of urgency, a release of the tension that had been building between them since the moment they had met. Ethan's hands moved over Lana's body, exploring the smooth, cool surface of her silver skin, which shimmered faintly in the dim light. The contrast between her alien beauty and the familiarity of the emotions they shared only heightened the intensity of their connection. Lana's hand slid up his back, her fingers tracing the muscles beneath his shirt. She moved with a grace that was both foreign and incredibly sensual, her touch sending shivers through him. Ethan could feel her body responding to his every movement, the electric charge between them building with each passing second. They undressed slowly, deliberately, the act itself a dance of trust and vulnerability. Every button undone, every piece of fabric discarded felt like shedding the barriers that had kept them apart. It was as if they were leaving behind not just their clothes, but also the weight of their responsibilities, the burden of their mission. In this moment, there was nothing else. Ethan's breath hitched as Lana's bare skin pressed against his, the warmth of her body grounding him in the present. Her hands roamed over his chest, her touch gentle but filled with a growing intensity. There was something almost reverent in the way she touched him, as though this connection between them was something sacred, something neither of them could fully understand but both were compelled to embrace. Their movements became more fluid, more instinctual, as if they had done this 1,000 times before. Ethan felt the heat between them rising, the pulse of desire quickening with every kiss, every touch. Lana's body arched beneath his, her breath coming in short, soft gasps as their bodies intertwined in a rhythm that felt both natural and otherworldly. Ethan couldn't help but marvel at the way they fit together, how despite their differences, human and alien, they moved as one. The boundaries that had once seemed so vast between them now felt non-existent, erased in the wake of their shared passion. It was more than just physical. It was a meeting of souls, a deep connection that transcended words or logic. Lana's eyes never left his, even in the heat of the moment. Her gaze was fierce, unwavering, as though she was silently telling him that this was more than just a union of their bodies. It was a merging of their worlds, their fates intertwined in a way that neither of them had anticipated, but both accepted. Ethan could feel the weight of that realization settling over him, but it didn't slow him down. It only fueled the fire burning between them. He kissed her harder, deeper, his hands exploring every inch of her body as she responded with equal intensity. The room around them seemed to disappear, the sterile walls of the lunar base fading into nothingness. It was just them, lost in the moment, in the heat of their desire. The sounds of their passion filled the space, soft gasps, the rustle of sheets, the thrum of their heartbeats pounding in sync. Time became meaningless as they gave in completely to the moment, to each other. And when the climax came, it wasn't explosive, but rather a slow, intense wave that washed over them both, leaving them breathless and spent. Their bodies trembled together, their hearts pounding in unison. As they reached the peak of their connection, for a long moment afterward, neither of them moved. They lay there wrapped in each other's arms, the heat of their shared passion still lingering in the air. Ethan's hand rested on Lana's bare back, tracing small circles on her skin as their breathing began to slow. Lana turned her head slightly, her golden eyes catching his in the soft light. There was a softness in her expression now, a quiet vulnerability that made Ethan's chest tighten. She reached up, her fingers brushing against his cheek, and for the first time Ethan saw the depth of emotion in her eyes. Something beyond desperation or survival. It was something human, something that connected them on a level he hadn't expected. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness of the room. Ethan's heart swelled with emotion as he looked down at her. He didn't need to ask what she was thanking him for. He knew. It wasn't just about what they had done, but what it represented. It was a promise, a commitment to something far greater than either of them. "You don't have to thank me," he replied softly, his voice thick with emotion. "We're in this together." They lay there for a long time, wrapped in the warmth of their shared intimacy, their bodies intertwined beneath the thin sheets. The world outside the room had changed. The stakes of their mission had changed. But in that moment, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the quiet connection they had forged. A bond that went beyond words, beyond logic, and beyond the boundaries of their two worlds. As the minutes passed and the adrenaline began to fade, Ethan felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected any of it. But now, with Lana lying beside him, her head resting on his chest, he realized that this was exactly where he was meant to be. Whatever came next, whatever challenges or dangers they would face, he knew they would face them together. The passion they had shared was just the beginning of something far greater, something that would change the course of their lives, and perhaps even the future of their two species. Ethan pressed a gentle kiss to Lana's forehead, his heart steady as he whispered, "We'll make this work." The silence in the room felt profound after the intensity of the night, as if the very air was holding its breath in the wake of what had just transpired. Ethan lay still, his chest rising and falling slowly as the weight of his choice settled over him like a heavy blanket. The passion that had consumed him only hours before had given way to a quiet, reflective calm. He stared up at the ceiling, the soft hum of the lunar base's systems barely registering in his mind as he tried to process everything. Beside him, Lana lay close, her head resting on his chest, her breathing soft and even. Her silver skin glowed faintly in the dim light, and the warmth of her body pressed against his felt both comforting and surreal. She looked so peaceful now. Her intently relaxed, her golden eyes closed as if for just a brief moment, the weight of her own responsibilities had lifted. Ethan couldn't help but wonder what was going through her mind. Did she feel the same pull he did? The same gravity of the decision they had made together? Because it wasn't just about them anymore. It was about something far bigger, something that would ripple far beyond this quiet moment into the uncertain future they both faced. He knew that crossing the line with Lana wasn't just a matter of fulfilling a desperate mission. It had been more than just biology, more than the necessity of ensuring the survival of her people. There had been something deeply human, deeply personal in their connection, an understanding that transcended their species. And now, as he lay there, feeling the lingering warmth of her touch, the weight of that realization bore down on him. He had made a choice, and it was one he couldn't take back. Slowly, Lana stirred beside him, her movements gentle but deliberate. Ethan's chest tightened as she lifted her head, her golden eyes finding his in the soft light. There was something in her gaze, something unspoken but deeply felt. She searched his face as if trying to read his thoughts, as if she knew that this quiet moment was the calm before the storm of questions, of doubts, of uncertainties. "Are you all right?" Lena's voice was quiet. The usual strength and command softened in the intimacy of the moment. It wasn't just a question about his physical state. He could hear the layers of meaning behind her words. She was asking if he was truly all right with everything they had just done, with the choice they had made together. Ethan swallowed, nodding slowly, but he knew that his answer would never fully capture the complexity of what he was feeling. He reached out, gently brushing a strand of her dark hair from her face, his fingers lingering on her cool skin. "I think so," he said, his voice low and thoughtful. "But it's a lot to process." Lana nodded in understanding, her own gaze turning inward for a moment as if she, too, was grappling with the enormity of what lay ahead. She shifted, sitting up slightly, the sheet falling away from her shoulders as she folded her hands in her lap. Her expression remained calm, but Ethan could see the faint tension in her posture, the weight of her responsibilities creeping back in. "I knew this wouldn't be easy," she admitted, her voice soft but filled with the quiet strength that had drawn Ethan to her from the start. "What we've done, it will change everything." Ethan sat up beside her, his bare skin cooling as the reality of her words settled over them both. Change everything. He had known that from the moment he agreed to help, but now, after sharing such an intimate moment with her, the full scope of that change seemed almost overwhelming. "This isn't just about us anymore," he said, his tone thoughtful as he ran a hand over his face. "It's about what happens next, about the world outside this room, about how people will react." about what this means for both of our species. Lana nodded, her antennae twitching slightly, a telltale sign of the uncertainty she rarely showed. I understand the risks. I know the consequences. But my people, they have no future without this. Without you. We've crossed the line. Ethan felt a knot form in his chest. The enormity of her words struck him deeply, but there was no escaping the truth of them. He had always been a man who made decisions quickly and decisively, but this was one that carried implications he could barely begin to fathom. He wasn't just a soldier following orders anymore. He was part of something that would shape the future of two civilizations. What if? Ethan began, but his voice trailed off as he struggled to find the right words. What if the world isn't ready for this? What if people don't understand? Lana turned to him, her golden eyes filled with a quiet determination. They won't be ready, she said softly, her voice unwavering, and many won't understand. There will be fear, resistance, even hatred. But that doesn't change what we've done or why we did it. This was about survival, about giving my people a chance to live. And now we have to stand by that decision no matter what comes. Ethan looked into her eyes, feeling the conviction in her words. She was right. There would be backlash, resistance, and probably worse. But they had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And despite the fear and uncertainty that came with it, Ethan knew that he couldn't walk away now. I'm with you, he said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions churning inside him. Whatever happens next, we face it together. Lana's gaze softened, and for a moment, the tension in the room seemed to ease. She reached out, her hand resting gently on his. Thank you, Ethan, she whispered, for everything. They sat there in silence for a while, the quiet hum of the lunar base filling the space between them. The intensity of the night had given way to a deeper, more profound connection, one that went beyond the physical. It was a shared understanding, a commitment to the path they had chosen. Despite the uncertainty that lay ahead, Ethan knew that the challenges were only just beginning. The world outside this room, the people, the politics, the fear of the unknown, would soon come crashing down around them. But as he sat there, his hand intertwined with Lana's, he felt a strange sense of he had made his choice, and now all that remained was to face whatever came next. Together, the lunar dawn cast a soft, muted glow over the base, its silvery light filtering through the narrow windows and spilling across the floor like a promise of something new. Ethan stood by the observation deck, gazing out at the vast emptiness of space, his mind heavy with the weight of recent events. Everything had changed in a matter of days. His mission, his purpose, his entire understanding of what the future could hold. Behind him, the familiar hum of the base's machinery was a constant reminder of the fragile balance. They were all walking. Ethan had spent years in the military, his life governed by rules and orders, his every move dictated by the chain of command. But here, in the aftermath of the decision he had made with Lana, the lines that had once defined his world had blurred into something entirely new. He turned slightly, glancing over his shoulder at the quiet figure resting on the bed. Lana lay still, her body curled in the thin sheets, her silver skin glowing faintly in the soft light. She looked peaceful, her breathing steady, her antennae relaxed. But Ethan knew that peace was fragile, temporary. There were no certainties in what they had done, only the hope that they had made the right choice and that the world would somehow come to understand it. But even as doubt tried to creep into his mind, there was something else, something stronger that pushed the doubt aside. A sense of purpose, a sense of new beginnings. The door to the room slid open quietly, and Ethan turned fully as Dr. Harper entered. Her expression unreadable but softened by the same understanding that had been shared between them all since the Kyle arrived. She crossed the room, her footsteps silent, but her presence grounding. How is she? Harper asked in a low voice, her gaze moving from Ethan to Lana as she approached the bedside. Ethan nodded slightly. She's resting. It's been a lot for both of us. He paused, then added, more than I ever thought it would be. Dr. Harper gave him a sympathetic look. I can only imagine, she said quietly, checking Lana's vitals with practiced ease. What you've both done, this choice you've made, it's unprecedented. It's a new world you're building together. Ethan glanced at her, the weight of those words settling over him once again. A new world. He hadn't thought of it in those terms before, but that's exactly what it was. They weren't just saving Lana's species. They were creating a future that bridged the gap between two civilizations, and a future that would be fraught with challenges, with resistance, and with fear. But it was also a future full of potential, of possibility. And that was what kept him going. As Dr. Harper finished her checks and quietly excused herself, Ethan's thoughts returned to the first moments after they had made their decision. There had been a brief flash of disbelief, a stunned silence in the wake of what they had agreed to do. But now, as he stood on the other side of that choice, the gravity of it felt less like a burden and more like a call to action. Lana stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open, and Ethan moved closer to the bed. Her golden gaze met his, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other, the silence between them filled with a quiet understanding. "How do you feel?" Ethan asked gently, sitting beside her on the edge of the bed. Lana took a slow breath, her voice soft but steady. "Different," she replied, her gaze drifting to the window where the moon's surface stretched out in an endless expanse. "Everything feels different now," Ethan nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. They had crossed a line, not just physically but emotionally, mentally. And now, the future they had set in motion was one that would unfold in ways neither of them could fully predict, but it was one they had chosen together. Lana sat up slowly, her silver skin shimmering as she moved. She reached out, her hand resting lightly on Ethan's arm. And when she spoke, her voice was filled with a quiet strength that mirrored his own thoughts. "We've started something," she said, her golden eyes locking onto his. "Something bigger than either of us. And now we have to see it through." Ethan covered her hand with his own, a deep sense of resolve settling over him. He had always been a man of action, a soldier who thrived in situations where the path was clear and the objective defined. But this was different. The path ahead wasn't clear, and the challenges they would face weren't ones he could solve with weapons or strategy. This was about building something new, something lasting. "I know," he replied quietly, his gaze steady on hers. "But we're not alone in this. We'll figure it out. Together." Lana's expression softened, and for the first time since their mission began, Ethan saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before: hope. It was faint, fragile, but it was real. She leaned forward, resting her forehead gently against his, her breath warm against his skin. "We will," she whispered. "We have to." They sat like that for a long moment, the silence between them no longer heavy with uncertainty, but filled with the quiet promise of what was to come. This was the beginning of something new, something neither of them had ever expected. And as daunting as it was, it also felt right. After a while, they both rose, preparing to face whatever challenges awaited them outside the quiet sanctuary of the room. Ethan helped Lena to her feet, their movements easy and fluid, as if they had already learned how to move through this new world together. As they left the room, stepping out into the sterile halls of the lunar base, the weight of their choice didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like a purpose, a mission that was bigger than any they had faced before. The base buzzed with the quiet energy of a world just waking up. Scientists moved about, their work resuming, and military personnel passed by, nodding in acknowledgement as they went. The world was still turning, still moving forward, and so would they. Ethan and Lana walked side by side, their pace slow but deliberate, the weight of what they had done still present but no longer overwhelming. This was the first step of many, the first of countless challenges and obstacles they would face together. But now they were ready. As they approached the command center, where the next phase of their mission awaited, Ethan glanced over at Lana, his expression resolute. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it," he said, his voice filled with the quiet determination that had carried him through countless battles before. "We've already proven that we're stronger together." Lana nodded, her golden eyes filled with the same fire. "Together," she agreed, her voice steady. And as they stepped forward, into the uncertain future that awaited them, Ethan knew that no matter what lay ahead, they had already begun something extraordinary, a new beginning, one that would shape not only their own lives but the future of their worlds.